What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Dredge, a Lovecraftian fishing game. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Dredge, really that 100% isn't difficult. The only thing that might take you some time, realistically, is catching all the different fish and their variations or aberrations as they're called, some of which require like Pokemon levels of tracking them down. But let's talk a little more specifically about what this game is. Now, as I mentioned, the simplest explanation really is just a Lovecraftian fishing game. However, that's really only a part of what this game is, because it also has just an incredible atmosphere really driving home those Lovecraftian vibes, but a really solid gameplay loop on top of that sees you doing things like managing upgrades to your ship, your gear, managing the literal inventory of that gear, alongside even quests and the like to get up to as you explore this sort of archipelago that you find yourself in. And with that said, probably worth a mention that this game initially came out all the way back in 2023, like March or April, I believe, and got nothing but praise at the time, and it's still very well loved to this day, though I didn't have time to check it out back then. I obviously wanted to, which is what we're doing here now when I finally found myself a little bit of time. In doing so, however, things might have worked out for us a bit here, because they have since dropped some DLC that I want to go over naturally. And one of those DLC I want to mention here because it does at least somewhat address one of my main complaints for the rest of the game, in that it actually potentially gives you the chance to have some real challenge or be threatened by the environment, because despite the Lovecraftian vibes, what this game does struggle with sometimes is presenting an actual challenge to the player. But from there, moving on to start with our usual stuff, let's talk about the technical state of this one. Honestly, this ran incredibly well for me. No notes, really. They've even got accessibility options to facilitate a few different play styles, like for instance, if you struggle with the fishing mini-games, they've got some options to address that as well. And honestly, from just looking at this game, you can probably tell it's not exactly hardware intensive, and it looks like it's running pretty well for everybody all around, so there's that. Now, next up is usually where I would talk about difficulty. Now, this game doesn't really have a difficulty per se, and is thus a very easy game. I just wanted to reiterate again that there are accessibility options to help with things like the fishing minigames, and the simple fact that most danger in this game can simply be avoided by reducing your character, or your boat, I suppose, panic level. Basically, the longer your character stays up through the day-night cycle, or gets too close to horrors, that kind of thing, your panic level rises, which can then see you start to hallucinate and attract other things to attack you, etc. But as long as you can manage that panic level, this is a very simple, easy title. Now let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it. So our character, at the beginning of the game, seems to be answering a help wanted ad for an angler in a small town not all that far from us. However, perhaps unsurprisingly, we get into a shipwreck along the way before waking up on a dock, only to pretty much be immediately pressed into service by the town's mayor, who replaces our boat at the cost of a loan, of course, and sends you out to get fishing. Now, right away, you might notice that things don't seem to be quite right here, with people saying very strange things to you and everyone having a sort of shifty vibe. And things start to get even stranger as you start fishing up strange, mutated versions of the fish you would normally find, which is what is likely going to eventually put you into contact with a collector that is after certain relics from the different biomes of this archipelago, which forms the bulk of the story. Basically, we're going to go to each different biome or area and do quests and any other activity necessary to facilitate finding that relic before bringing it back. And along the way, if you're paying attention, you'll start to probably uncover what actually happened here, which then culminates in up to 2 different endings. Now, the alternative ending, or the best ending you could hope for, I suppose, really comes down to just whether or not you found and explored one specific island to trigger a conversation with someone else, so it's a very easy ending to obtain. But both endings are, I would say, very Lovecraftian in nature. That is to say, good endings are fairly hard to come by. Now, with that out of the way, broadly speaking, I would say that I enjoyed the story of this one quite a bit. You uncover more and more as you go. It just oozes atmosphere of Lovecraft and that fear of the unknown. And that, coupled with the deep sea in general and the inherent unknown of that, really pairs very well together, as you might imagine, in a way that is very reminiscent, to me at least, of Shadows over Innsmouth. That said, this game does seem to be fairly front-loaded in that regard. I would say probably the first 5 or so hours of this roughly 10-hour story experience, and like 15 to 20 if you want to do everything for the most part outside of the DLCs. It is nonetheless very front-loaded. Those first few hours are really where most of the really engaging stuff happens. And then as you get into a bit of a routine, building up money and upgrades and everything and removing the few barriers the game has for you, suddenly it becomes very easy and things progress very, very quickly. And while it's mostly a nitpick, the pacing can feel a little bit weird in the back half, which brings us to the progression systems of this game. So there's actually quite a bit of progression going on here. As we make our way through the story, we'll be gaining abilities for each relic that we deliver to the collector, including the ability to teleport back to the collector's island in the sort of centralized area of the map, which then allows you to quickly get everywhere else. There's an ability that banishes threats that might be trying to attack you. There's an ability that instantly harvests all the fish from a fishing node, as an example. So just that is important, of course. But then there's also your research and equipment. Now, some equipment becomes available just at the shops at the harbors normally, and you'll be able to go to the shipwrights there and buy new equipment, but some of it requires research to be done. You'll have to track down or earn research parts from quests or simply fishing them up sometimes, and then you spend those research parts on your research tree looking into different types of equipment. Everything from fishing rods, new engines, trawling nets to catch fish passively. Now, while that forms the bulk of how you're going to get that stuff, sometimes you can find more, let's say, exotic variants of those things by finding and solving mysterious shrine-like puzzles out in the open sea. So there's some stuff going on there as well. Now, as you complete quests and things, you might also find yourself in possession of some books, and as you slowly read through those, you'll eventually earn perks that passively upgrade your boat at the same time. And then finally, there's the ship upgrade themselves. You'll start out with a very, I would say, very worse for wear little boat, only to upgrade it over time, and even once more via the DLC, to be a very impressive ship that can both take more damage from you running into things or being attacked, but also hold more fish and parts and things so you can do more and more of what the game is all about. So you go from it taking basically all day to go much of anywhere to being able to cross the map in like 2 or 3 in-game hours, which dramatically speeds up the things you can do. And let's talk about some of those things you can do as part of the gameplay and world section. So there's not really going to be a combat section for this game, as there isn't really in the strictest sense, but basically we are around an archipelago. We start at roughly the middle in a place called the Marrows, and then as we progress the story, we're going to be sent to the 4 different biomes surrounding the Marrows, and then later on to extra areas via the DLC. Now, most of what you do here is pretty much what you would imagine. Catch fish and employ different fishing methods to catch different fish. Each fishing node has a type associated with it, and you need certain types of equipment to fish basically anything. And that's important even for the questing that is in the game, because in basically every area you're going to run into people either at docks or people you find through other means who are going to need your help, and a lot of times this simply involves catching fish, as you might imagine, which you then turn into them. But some of it is a little more, I would say, interesting, as for instance, you can get your hands on explosives, which will allow you to blow open corridors in order to find different resources and the like to facilitate some of your upgrades. But all of that, both gathering resources and then actually fishing, of course, all feeds into this really fantastic gameplay loop when you throw in the day-night cycle. Now, day is pretty unremarkable, as you might expect, but nighttime is where things get interesting, because your panic starts to rise and you're much more likely to be attacked. At least that is prior to getting the banish ability to just, banish some of those threats. Now, the dangers of nighttime can be completely avoided by simply resting at a dock during the nighttime, of course, to simply pass the time to the next dawn. So while there is a certain fear that your boat could be damaged and there are things you need to avoid, including other hazards specific to each biome, by and large, the danger is only as present as you allow it to be. But it nonetheless does manage to succeed in making this incredibly eerie atmosphere, which is what this game does best. But let's talk about fishing and some of the other things you can do with your boat. So whenever you're exploring or whatever you're doing comes down to gathering all of these fish and resources. This is basically done by fishing or dredging, all of which are performed through various little mini games. Now, there are about 4 or 5 of these for the different types of fish you can catch, and you're going to simply play a little timing game in order to reel this stuff in. In addition to catching fish, though, it is possible to fish up, let's say, trinkets or materials via dredging. And this is either going to allow you to find just jewelry or valuable things to sell, but also acquire materials that you're going to use for all of your upgrades at the same time. And while some of that might sound boring individually, when you put it all together is where this game is really, really great, because you start the day off, you might need to go fish, you might need to actually make it somewhere to facilitate the next part of a story or a goal. If you're looking for specific fish, you're going to have to consult the encyclopedia most likely to find out how to find them if you even have the equipment to get it, which means you spend all this time either upgrading your ship or pursuing different objectives while pretty much always progressing some form of progression at the same time. All while you're trying to avoid nighttime and the rising panic level of your character against the backdrop of this dreary coastal environment, and it definitely makes for something special as a result. But from there, let's talk about the DLC for this one. So there are, I would say, 2 big noteworthy DLCs and then a handful of smaller ones. So we're going to talk about the 2 major content DLCs. One I liked a lot, one not so much. Now the first one, the Pale Reach, is the one I didn't really enjoy. This is like a 2 or 3 hour adventure that sends you to an iceberg down in the southern portion of the map, and you're going to fish up some different types of fish via ice fishing, as you might imagine. And there's a handful of quests to do down here, including grabbing an icebreaker that's going to let you break through different passages. And while I wouldn't say I hated this DLC or anything, the problem is that almost everything about it is self-contained. The type of fishing that you need to do here is only specific to here. The quests are very quick and don't take very long at all. And while it has 1 or 2 cool moments, it just doesn't really affect any of the rest of the game in any way. And as a result, it doesn't quite live up to what the rest of the game has to offer. In fact, I would really go so far as to say that the only really notable thing from this one is that the final secret reward you can get is an incredible trawling net. That is invaluable, but otherwise I really didn't have a good time with that one. But then we have the other one, the Iron Rig. So the Iron Rig can either be done separately, or you can start it early and it will affect the entire campaign. And this is because you go to a oil rig nearby that is having some trouble getting set up, and you can start fishing their lost convoy ships to dredge up supplies to bring them and help build out the oil rig to make a bunch of different facilities, which gives you access to all sorts of new equipment and things you can do to attach to your boat to increase various abilities, etc. Now you can do that part whenever, but when you do, it will start dropping oil spills in the biomes that you go via the story in that order, meaning that if you want to start the Iron Rig early, you can actually significantly mix up the flow of the story as a result, because you'll be dealing with all of this. Or you can wait till after the story's done. But those oil spills come with, of course, new content, new quests to enjoy, secret types of fish to find. The oil spills themselves naturally kind of mix things up as they have to be navigated a bit differently. And you can even purchase further upgrades to your ship to really drive the whole thing home, and not least of which, the actual story around the oil rig and how that progresses is also really great. I think the Iron Rig in particular is a fantastic DLC that really rounds out this experience in a way that the Pale Reach just couldn't quite manage. So that's definitely something to know. Now that does bring us to the Steam Deck section before we start wrapping it up. Steam Deck's pretty straightforward here. As you might imagine, this game is in fact verified. Controller support, cloud saves, everything you'd expect. I just wanted to throw a quick note out there that Dredge plays very well there. And if you haven't been doing so already and you want to play this on the go via that platform, it's definitely a good way to go about it. Now let's talk positives. So the positives for me on this one are the atmosphere, the gameplay loop, and how very engaging they managed to make all of that. And then there's like these little mysteries and secrets and giant sea monsters you're going to see along the way that really add to the experience, and they did a fantastic job with it. Now on the negative side of things, for me, I do wish they had made things like panic and the attacks from the sea monsters and whatnot that can occasionally happen a little more threatening. I think it's too easy to completely avoid any amount of pressure. There's also just a couple pacing problems that I mentioned. The back half of the game tends to just kind of fly by because once you have some of this progression done, there is just nothing left in the game to do really than just go grab the stuff you need, which means that I don't think the back half is nearly quite as good as the opening or the first few hours really. And then, as I mentioned, I think the Pale Reach DLC is a bit underwhelming, especially compared to the Iron Rig. But all in all, that of course brings us to our conclusion, and Dredge is normally $25 full price over on Steam, and then the DLC itself is a little more than that, like $40 US, I believe, which might be a little bit pricey compared to the time you're likely to spend with this one. However, with that in mind, we're more than a year out now, so it's pretty easy to find this on sale regularly. I believe it's actually on sale at the time this video is going live. But for that price, I think you're getting a fantastic experience with a few minor gripes that may or may not bother you depending on how long you actually spend with the title. So for me, naturally, that's a buy, and I feel pretty good about having spent about $30 on this one for myself. That is where we are going to leave off this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful, especially if you hadn't played the DLC since it launched originally, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.